My name is Claire Montgomery, and I'm 65 years old. For 3 decades, I worked as a senior investigator specializing in insurance fraud and financial crimes, unraveling schemes that would make your head spin. I thought those days of chasing criminals through paper trails were behind me, tucked away with my retirement and my quiet life in my Phoenix suburban home. I never imagined that the skills I'd honed catching liars and thieves would become the very weapons I'd need to save myself from my own daughter-in-law. It started on a December morning, the kind where Arizona's winter sun feels deceptively warm, that the air carries a sharpness that gets under your skin. I woke up to silence, but not the peaceful kind. This was the heavy, suffocating quiet that settles over a room when people have been whispering about you, plotting against you, and suddenly you walk in. The house felt different, like the walls themselves had turned against me. I found them in the sunroom, the place where my late husband, David, and I used to drink our morning coffee and watch the desert come alive with light. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, sat at the glass table with a mug in front of her, untouched and growing cold. My son, Ethan, stood behind her with his arms crossed, staring at a spot on the terracotta tiles like it held answers to questions he was too afraid to ask. Neither of them looked at me when I walked in. That was my first clue. In 30 years of investigating fraud, I learned that guilty people avoid eye contact. It's not a conscious choice. It's instinct. The body knows what the mouth refuses to admit. Vanessa spoke first. She always did. Her voice was flat, almost bored, like she was announcing a change in dinner reservations rather than dropping a bomb that would shatter my world. "We sold your Lexus while you were sleeping, Claire. The money's already in our account." I stood frozen in the doorway, my hands still resting on the frame. The words didn't register at first, not because I didn't hear them, but because my brain refused to process their meaning. My Lexus, the car David and I had bought together 4 years ago, just before the cancer took him. The one he insisted I deserved after decades of driving practical sedans and hand-me-downs. The car I drove through the desert on clear days just to feel like I was still connected to him, to the life we'd built together. "What did you just say?" I asked, though every word had been crystal clear. Vanessa finally looked at me. There was something in her eyes I'd seen before, not in family members, but in suspects, sitting across interrogation tables. That particular gleam of triumph mixed with contempt, the look of someone who believes they've already won. "You heard me, Claire. It's done. The title's transferred. The funds are deposited. The car was wasted on an old woman who barely drives anyway." I turned to Ethan, my son. The boy I'd taught to ride a bike, to throw a baseball, to look people in the eye when he shook their hands. He was 41 now, with a wife and 2 daughters of his own, and he couldn't lift his gaze from the floor. "Ethan," I said. Just his name. A question and a plea, wrapped in 2 syllables. He shifted his weight, his hands gripping the back of Vanessa's chair so tightly, his knuckles had gone white. "It's done, Mom," he mumbled. "Just accept it. Just accept it." 3 words that told me everything I needed to know about what had happened to my son in the years since he married this woman. Somewhere along the way, the man I'd raised had been hollowed out and filled with something that answered to her voice instead of his own conscience. Vanessa launched into an explanation I hadn't asked for. The money was needed for family plans, renovations to the house, investments for the girls' college funds, responsible financial management. She spoke as if she were doing me a favor, relieving me of a burden I was too old and foolish to handle myself. Every word dripped with condescension, the kind reserved for people you consider beneath you. I said nothing. I had learned long ago that silence is its own kind of weapon. While Vanessa talked, I watched. I noted the rehearsed quality of her speech, the way Ethan flinched slightly at certain phrases, the absence of any documentation on the table. They had planned this, discussed it without me, executed it without my knowledge. And now they were presenting it as if it were already settled, unchangeable, final. This wasn't impulse, it was strategy. In 30 years of investigating fraud, I'd seen this pattern hundreds of times. The initial theft is never the end. It's a test. Predators start small to gauge their victim's response. If the victim accepts the first violation, larger ones follow. The Lexus wasn't about the money. It was about establishing dominance, proving that they could take from me and I would do nothing to stop them. I looked at Vanessa, really looked at her, and I saw what I'd been too blinded by family loyalty to see before. She wore the same expression I'd seen on every fraudster who thought they were smarter than everyone else. They were always wrong. It just took time to prove it. I turned and walked out of the sunroom without a word. Behind me, I heard Vanessa laugh softly. She thought my silence meant surrender. She thought I was just a confused old woman who would accept whatever scraps of dignity she allowed me to keep. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I spent the morning in my bedroom with the door closed, listening to the muffled sounds of conversation drifting through the house. Vanessa's voice carried. It always did, sharp and insistent, punctuated by long silences that I assumed were Ethan nodding along to whatever she said. I sat on the edge of the bed David and I had shared for 38 years and stared at the photograph on my nightstand. His smile looked back at me, frozen in a moment from our anniversary trip to Sedona, the red rocks glowing behind him like fire. He'd been gone 3 years now, but some mornings I still reached for him in my sleep, my hand finding only empty space and cold sheets. The knock came just after noon. Ethan opened the door without waiting for an answer, something he never would have done when his father was alive. He stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable, his hands shoved deep in his pockets like a teenager caught in a lie. "Mom, can you come downstairs? Vanessa wants to talk about something." I followed him to the dining room, where Vanessa sat waiting with a stack of papers, arranged neatly in front of her. The documents were thick, official-looking, bristling with colored tabs marking signature lines. She had prepared for this. The Lexus conversation that morning had been a prelude, a softening blow before the real attack. I understood that now. "Sit down, Claire," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Not a request, a command. I remained standing. She pushed the papers toward me anyway. "These are property transfer documents. We need you to sign the house over to Ethan and me. We have plans for renovations, updates that will increase the value significantly, but we need full control to move forward. It's for everyone's benefit. Really. Yours included. Parentheses. I looked at the documents without touching them. 38 years of my life sat in that stack of paper. The house David and I bought when Ethan was still in diapers. The kitchen where I taught him to make pancakes on Sunday mornings. The backyard where David built a treehouse that Ethan outgrew, but we never tore down. The bedroom where David took his last breath, holding my hand, telling me to be strong. "I don't thank you." It was, they wanted me to sign it all away. Parentheses. Ethan stepped forward, his voice soft and pleading. "Mom, please don't make this difficult. It's just paperwork. You'll still live here. Nothing changes for your day-to-day life. We just need the title for renovation loans." Parentheses. He reached out as if to touch my arm, then pulled back. His eyes darted to Vanessa, then to the floor. He couldn't look at me. End parentheses. "Strong. Please, Mom, just sign it." I studied my son's face, searching for the boy I'd raised. He was in there somewhere, buried beneath years of something I was only beginning to understand. His voice trembled when he spoke, but not from emotion for me, from fear of her. I had seen that particular tremor before in witnesses too terrified to tell the truth. Ethan had learned not to contradict his wife. The cost of disagreement Whatever it was had trained that instinct out of him. I reached down and pushed the papers back across the table without picking them up. I need time to think. Vanessa's expression shifted. She had expected argument, perhaps anger, accusations, the kind of emotional reaction she could twist and use against me. My calm refusal was not part of her script. Her jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Time to think about what? It's a simple signature. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. I need time, I repeated. I turned and walked toward the front door. Don't take too long, old woman. Her voice followed me down the hallway, sharp with contempt. You don't have many options left. Where exactly do you think you're going to go? I heard her laugh as I reached for the doorknob, a short, dismissive sound meant for Ethan's ears. She'll come crawling back. They always do when they realize they have nowhere else to go. I closed the door quietly behind me and walked to my car. Not the Lexus, that was gone now, but the old Toyota I kept for errands. The engine turned over reluctantly in the heat. I sat for a moment, letting it idle, watching my breath in the frigid air conditioning. Through the window, I could see Vanessa and Ethan moving in the dining room. She was talking, gesturing emphatically. He stood with his head bowed, nodding. I drove to a coffee shop 4 miles from the house, a small place David and I used to visit on Saturday mornings. It was quiet enough for conversation, anonymous enough that no one would notice an old woman sitting alone. I ordered black coffee and found a corner booth where I could see the door. From my purse, I pulled a small notebook, the same kind I'd carried throughout my career, the kind that had helped send dozens of fraudsters to prison. I opened to a fresh page and began to write. The Lexus sale, no prior discussion, no documentation shown, funds transferred to their account. The house transfer demand, prepared documents, rehearsed justifications, Ethan's scripted plea, Vanessa's demeanor, confident, controlling, contemptuous, Ethan's behavior, submissive, fearful, unable to maintain eye contact. This was not retreat. This was reconnaissance. The first rule I learned as an investigator: let the target believe they're winning. Overconfidence breeds carelessness. Carelessness creates evidence. I closed the notebook and pulled out my phone. There was one person David had trusted absolutely, one person he'd confided in during those final months, when he grew quiet and thoughtful. At the time, I assumed he was making peace with his illness. Now, I wondered if he had seen something I'd missed, if he had been preparing for exactly this moment. I found the number and pressed call. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Claire? Is everything all right?" I took a breath. "Rachel, I need your help." David was right about everything. Rachel Bennett agreed to meet me the following afternoon at her law office in downtown Phoenix. I spent the night at a hotel near the interstate, a clean but unremarkable place where nobody asked questions and the coffee was terrible. I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Vanessa's smile, that particular curve of satisfaction she wore when she told me about the Lexus. Predators always smile when they think they've won. Before driving to see Rachel, I made a detour. Some conversations need to happen first, even if only one person can speak. The cemetery sat on a gentle hillside on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by desert landscape and the kind of silence that invites both grief and healing. I parked near the iron gate and walked the familiar path to David's plot. The headstone was simple, gray granite, the way he'd wanted it. David Montgomery, 1955 to 2022, beloved husband and father. 3 years since I'd stood in the same spot, watching them lower his casket into the ground. 3 years of learning how to breathe without him. I brushed the dust from the stone bench nearby and sat down. The heat was already building, even though it was early morning. "They sold the Lexus," I said aloud. My voice sounded strange in the stillness, old and rough. "The one you made me buy. You said I deserved something beautiful, after all those years of practical choices. I paused, watching a hawk circle overhead. They want the house now, David. Our house. The one where we raised Ethan, where you planted those roses that never grew right, where you spent your last morning looking out at the mountains. The wind picked up, rustling through the sparse vegetation. You tried to warn me. I remember now, that dinner 3 years ago, when Vanessa was still pretending to like us. You pulled me aside in the kitchen while she was showing off pictures of the renovation she wanted for their bathroom. You said, "Claire, watch Vanessa carefully. She doesn't see family when she looks at us. She sees opportunity." I had dismissed him then. David was protective of Ethan, sometimes overly so, or that's what I'd told myself. I thought he was being unfair to his daughter-in-law, holding on to the father's instinct to find fault with any woman who took his son's attention. I should have known better. In 40 years of marriage, David's instincts were wrong exactly never. Sitting there in the growing heat, I thought about the work that had defined my life. 30 years as a senior fraud investigator, reviewing thousands of cases that most people couldn't imagine. Inheritance fraud, where children forged their parents' signatures on documents while the ink was still wet on death certificates. Elder exploitation, where caregivers and relatives drained bank accounts one small transaction at a time until nothing remained. Identity theft so sophisticated that victims didn't realize they'd been robbed until collection agencies came calling for debts they never incurred. I had testified in court dozens of times, explaining to juries how these schemes worked. The patterns were always the same. Predators identified vulnerable targets, usually elderly, often isolated, frequently grieving. They established trust and access. They tested boundaries with small violations, gauging the victim's response. If the victim accepted or failed to notice, larger thefts followed. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the damage was catastrophic. I knew exactly how these people operated. I had spent my career stopping them. And now one of them was living in my son's house, sleeping beside him every night, raising my granddaughters. A memory surfaced, unbidden. David's last months, before the cancer took his ability to walk. He had spent unusual amounts of time on his computer, typing with a focus I recognized from his accounting days when he prepared tax returns. I'd asked him once what he was working on, and he'd looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Serious and determined and something else. Love, maybe. The fierce kind. Preparing, he'd said, just in case. In case of what? He'd only smiled and returned to his typing. I'd assumed he was organizing our finances, updating his will, the practical matters that people attend to when they know time is short. I didn't press further. I was too busy trying to hold on to every remaining moment with him, to question how he spent them. Now, sitting at his grave, the meaning of those words began to shift. Just in case. David knew. He saw what Vanessa was before I did. And he spent his final weeks preparing for a battle he wouldn't live to fight. The thought brought tears to my eyes. Not just grief, but gratitude and shame mixed together. He had tried to protect me even as he was dying, and I had been too blind to see it. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting the heat. I placed my hand on the top of his headstone, feeling the rough granite beneath my palm. "I won't let her take what we built," I said quietly. "I promise you, David, whatever you prepared, whatever you left behind, I'll find it, and I'll finish what you started." The wind died down, and for a moment the cemetery was perfectly still. I took it as his answer. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. I walked back to my car with a steadier step than I'd had in months. Rachel was waiting for me downtown, the one person David had trusted with everything. It was time to find out exactly what my husband had known and what he had done about it. Rachel Bennett's law office occupied the 12th floor of a glass tower in downtown Phoenix. The reception area was tasteful without being ostentatious. Leather chairs, framed landscapes of desert sunsets, a coffee table with neatly arranged legal journals. It was the kind of space designed to communicate confidence and discretion, and it succeeded on both counts. I gave my name to the young man at the front desk, and within moments, Rachel appeared in the doorway. She was 60 now, her hair silver and styled in a short, elegant cut. She carried herself with the same quiet confidence I remembered from David's funeral. She had delivered the eulogy that day, dry-eyed and steady-voiced, speaking of her best friend with a precision that honored David's memory better than tears ever could. She took my hand in both of her hands. "Come in. I've been expecting you since your call yesterday." Her private office overlooked the city, the desert mountains visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. She gestured me to a comfortable chair across from her desk and poured coffee from a silver carafe without asking if I wanted any. She remembered how I took it. Black, no sugar. 40 years of friendship with David had made her practically family. "Tell me everything," she said, settling into her chair with a leather-bound journal open before her. "From the beginning, don't leave anything out." So I told her. The Lexus announcement delivered with that cold triumph in Vanessa's eyes. The property transfer documents appearing hours later, tabs marking every signature line. Ethan's trembling plea and his inability to meet my gaze. Vanessa's contempt as I walked out the door, her certainty that I would come crawling back. I spoke for nearly 2 hours, and Rachel listened without interrupting, her pen moving steadily across the page. When I finished, she set down her pen and removed her reading glasses. Her expression was grave, but unsurprised. "This is textbook elder financial exploitation," she said. "I've seen it dozens of times in my career. The pattern is almost always the same. Establish control, test boundaries, escalate demands. The Lexus was a test. The house is the real target." She paused, studying me with sharp eyes. "What was Vanessa's maiden name again?" "Sullivan," I said. "Vanessa Sullivan." Something shifted in Rachel's expression. Her brow furrowed, and she leaned back in her chair with an intensity I hadn't seen before. "Sullivan, Richard Sullivan's stepdaughter." I nodded slowly. "Her mother married him when Vanessa was in college, I think. He died about 6 years ago. Why?" Rachel was already reaching for her computer, typing rapidly. "That name came across my desk years ago, an inheritance dispute. Richard Sullivan's brother filed a complaint after his death. He claimed the estate distribution was irregular, that undue influence was involved." She scrolled through what I assumed were old case files, her frown deepening. "The case was dismissed for insufficient evidence, but I remember the details. Let me look into this further." She made a note in her journal and underlined it twice. I filed the information away. In my years of investigating fraud, I had learned that coincidences were rarely coincidental. "Here's what we're going to do," Rachel continued, shifting into what I recognized as her strategy mode. "First, you sign nothing. Not a single document, no matter how innocent it appears. Second, you don't confront Vanessa directly. Let her believe she's winning. Predators get sloppy when they think their prey is helpless." She leaned forward. "Third, we gather evidence. Arizona is a one-party consent state, which means you can legally record any conversation you're part of without informing the other party. I want you to document everything. Dates, times, exact words spoken. Your training makes you ideal for this." I nodded. These were principles I had operated under for 30 years, now turned to my own defense. Rachel's expression softened slightly. "There's something else you need to know, Claire. Something I probably should have told you sooner, but David made me promise to wait until it was necessary." She rose from her desk and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner of the office. From the top drawer, she withdrew a manila folder, thick with documents. She held it for a moment as if weighing whether to continue. "David came to see me 7 months before he died," Rachel said quietly. "He was already sick then, though he hid it well. He wanted to update his will. Not just the standard provisions, but specific additions, protections." She returned to her desk and sat down, the folder closed beneath her hands. "He was thorough, Claire. Meticulous. He anticipated scenarios I thought were paranoid at the time." My throat tightened. "He knew. Even then." "Even then, he suspected," Rachel said. "He told me he had concerns about Vanessa, about the influence she had over Ethan. He wanted to make sure that if anything happened, if you ever found yourself in a vulnerable position, there would be safeguards in place." Her voice dropped. She dropped. "Even then, he loved you very much, Claire. And he was afraid for you, afraid of what might happen after he was gone." I thought of David, at his computer in those final months, typing with quiet determination, preparing, just in case. He had spent his days building a fortress around me, brick by careful brick, and I had never known. Rachel slid the folder across the desk toward me. "There's something in his will you need to see. Something he added specifically to protect you from exactly what's happening now." I stared at the folder, afraid to open it. Whatever was inside would change everything. I could feel it. David's voice echoed in my memory, that mysterious smile when I'd asked what he was working on. Just in case. I opened the folder with hands that trembled slightly. Inside were several documents, but Rachel directed my attention to one in particular, a legal addendum to David's will dated 9 months before his death. The language was dense with legal terminology, but one phrase stood out in bold type: Anti-Coercion Protection Clause. David insisted on this provision, Rachel explained, leaning forward in her chair. "It's unusual, but entirely enforceable under Arizona law. In simple terms, it states that any transfer of property or assets involving you is automatically void if made under duress, manipulation, or undue influence." I read the words again, trying to absorb their meaning. Void, even if I signed something? Even then, Rachel's voice carried a note of admiration. David did his research. He understood that predators often obtain signatures through pressure, deception, or exploitation of trust. This clause creates a legal shield. If we can demonstrate that you were coerced into any transaction, the Lexus sale, the house transfer, anything, the entire agreement becomes invalid. It's as if the signature never existed. I sat back in my chair, stunned. David had built a fortress around me, using nothing but foresight and legal precision. While I was holding his hand through chemotherapy treatments, while I was learning to cook the soups he could no longer prepare himself, he was quietly constructing defenses against a threat I couldn't see. How did he know? I asked, though the question was really for myself. How could he have predicted this? Rachel's expression softened. He didn't know for certain, but he suspected. He told me once that Vanessa reminded him of a client he'd dealt with years ago in his accounting practice. Charming on the surface, calculating underneath. Someone who manipulated financial records, not because they needed to, but because they enjoyed getting away with it. She paused. David was an accountant for 40 years. He learned to recognize certain types of people. There was more in the folder. Rachel withdrew a sealed envelope, cream-colored and slightly worn at the edges, as if it had been handled many times before being put away. My name was written across the front in David's elegant handwriting, the same script I'd seen on birthday cards, anniversary notes, love letters he'd tucked into my briefcase before long business trips. "He left this with specific instructions," Rachel said, placing it gently in my hands. "It's only to be opened when, his words, the betrayal becomes undeniable. He wanted you to have it at the right moment, not before." The envelope was light, containing perhaps a single sheet of paper, maybe two. I turned it over, running my thumb across the sealed flap. Every instinct told me to tear it open immediately, to hear David's voice one more time through whatever words he'd left behind. But Rachel's hand covered mine. "Save it, Claire. You'll know when the time is right. Trust his timing, the way you trusted everything else about him." I nodded slowly and slipped the envelope into my purse, close to my heart. The weight of it was almost nothing, yet I felt it like an anchor, something solid to hold on to in the storm that was gathering around me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across Rachel's desk. I thought about David in his final months, weakened by illness, but sharp as ever in his mind. He must have known he was dying, must have felt the time slipping away. Yet he chose to spend precious hours protecting a future he would never see. The love in that choice was almost unbearable to contemplate. "He's still fighting for me," I said quietly. "Even now." He never stopped. Rachel's voice was thick with emotion she rarely showed. "That man loved you more than anyone I've ever known, and he was determined that love would outlast him." We spent the next hour discussing strategy. The anti-coercion clause was powerful, but it required evidence to activate. We needed documentation of every threat Vanessa made, every manipulation she attempted, recordings of conversations, written communications, financial records showing irregularities. Each piece would build the case that I was being exploited, and once that case was strong enough, every document Vanessa forced me to sign would dissolve like morning frost. "David gave you armor," Rachel said as she walked me to the door. "But armor alone doesn't win battles. Now we need to catch Vanessa swinging the sword, on record, with witnesses, in ways that can't be denied or explained away." She gripped my arm with surprising strength. "Be patient, Claire. Let her come to you. Let her make mistakes." I drove back to the hotel as the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The envelope in my purse pressed against my chest with every breath. I wasn't ready to open it yet. Rachel was right about that. But knowing it was there, knowing David had left me one final message, gave me a strength I hadn't felt since the morning they told me his cancer was terminal. I was sitting on the edge of the hotel bed, still in my coat, when my phone rang. The screen displayed Ethan's home number, but the voice that greeted me was not my son's. "Claire." Vanessa's tone was clipped, businesslike, with an undercurrent of something darker. "We need to talk about your finances. I've been looking at your accounts, and there are some changes that need to happen immediately." My blood ran cold. She had access to my accounts. Somehow, without my knowledge or consent, she had already begun to dig her claws into everything I had. I steadied my breathing before responding. Rachel's advice echoed in my mind. Document everything. With my free hand, I activated the recording app on my phone, the one I downloaded that afternoon at her suggestion. The red indicator light blinked silently in the dim hotel room. "What do you mean you've been looking at my accounts?" I kept my voice neutral, slightly confused, the tone of an old woman struggling to understand. It wasn't difficult to fake. Part of me genuinely couldn't believe what I was hearing. Vanessa sighed with the exaggerated patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a slow child. "Your credit history, Claire. It's excellent, which is wasted on someone your age. So we used it to open a new line of credit. $50,000. The money's already been transferred to our account." She paused, and I could almost hear her smile through the phone. "You should thank us, really. We're improving your portfolio, diversifying your assets." $50,000 opened in my name, without my knowledge or consent. The crime had a name: identity theft, credit fraud, and Vanessa was confessing to it as casually as if she were discussing the weather. "When did you do this?" I asked, forcing bewilderment into my voice. "How is that even possible without my signature?" "Oh, Claire." She laughed, a sharp sound that held no warmth. You signed plenty of things at family dinners over the years. Birthday cards, holiday forms, documents Ethan brought over. You never read them carefully, did you? A few of those signatures proved very useful. My stomach turned. I thought of all the papers Ethan had casually handed me over the years. Forms for the girls' school events, holiday cards that required my name on a line. Had they been harvesting my signature all along, building a collection they could forge whenever convenient? The methodical nature of it chilled me more than the theft itself. "I don't understand," I said, playing the part she expected. "Why would you need to do this?" "Because you're too old to make good financial decisions anymore." Her tone sharpened. "The Lexus was just sitting in your garage depreciating. The house is falling apart because you won't invest in proper renovations. You're sitting on assets you don't know how to use. We're helping you, Claire, whether you appreciate it or not." In the background, I heard movement. Footsteps, perhaps. Ethan walking nearby. Then silence, an oddly long pause where the ambient noise seemed muffled. I strained to listen. Was Ethan covering the microphone, trying to prevent me from hearing something, or trying to prevent Vanessa from hearing him? The moment passed too quickly to be certain, but I filed it away. Every detail mattered now. Vanessa's voice returned, clear and sharp. "My stepfather left me everything when he died. You know, his brother tried to contest it, but he couldn't prove anything." She laughed again, that cold, confident sound. "I know how to handle difficult old people who think they know better than everyone else. Richard learned eventually. You will too." The name hit me like a physical blow. Richard. Richard Sullivan. Rachel's words from earlier that day returned with sudden clarity. That name came across my desk years ago. Something about an inheritance dispute. Okay, she wasn't just talking about managing difficult relatives. She was boasting about a previous conquest. Her stepfather had been the first, and I was meant to be the next. M.P. I said nothing. Let her interpret my silence as defeat. M. Strong. Here's what's going to happen. Vanessa continued, her voice dropping into the register of command. You're going to sign the house transfer papers by Saturday. That's 4 days from now. If you don't, you'll find yourself without a place to live. The hotel you're staying at costs money you don't have. Not anymore. Your accounts are restructured. Your credit is extended in ways you don't understand. The only path forward is through us. Still, I remained silent, letting the recording capture every word. M. Strong. Saturday, Claire. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Ethan and I are trying to help you, even if you're too stubborn to see it. The line went dead. I sat in the darkness for a long moment, the phone still pressed to my ear, the recording still running. Through the thin hotel curtains, I could see the lights of passing cars on the highway. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware of the quiet war being waged in this anonymous room. The icing hidden window. People to see that light passing cars on the highway. An animus building must have played itself out on this anonymous room. It was no longer about a car or even a house. This was systematic destruction. Financial, legal, personal. Vanessa had spent years laying groundwork, collecting signatures, establishing control over Ethan, waiting for David to die and leave me vulnerable. She had done it before to her stepfather. She was doing it again to me. But she had made a mistake. She had assumed I was just another confused old woman too proud to ask for help and too weak to fight back. She didn't know about Rachel. She didn't know about David's protection clause. And she didn't know that I had spent 30 years catching people exactly like her. I stopped the recording and saved the file. Then I composed a text to Rachel, attaching the audio. She just admitted to credit fraud and referenced her stepfather's inheritance. She gave herself a deadline. Saturday. What's our next move? The response came within minutes. Perfect. Let her think she's winning. Come to my office tomorrow morning. We're building something she won't see coming. I set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. Saturday was 4 days away. 4 days to gather evidence, to set the trap, to prepare for a confrontation that would determine the rest of my life. David's envelope pressed against my chest, a reminder that I wasn't fighting alone. Vanessa wanted war. She was about to discover she had chosen the wrong enemy. I spent the next 3 days preparing. Rachel and I met each morning, refining our strategy, reviewing the recording of Vanessa's phone call, discussing how to obtain the physical evidence we needed. By Saturday morning, I was ready to walk back into the house where I'd raised my son and face the woman who was trying to destroy me. I arrived unannounced just after 10. The Arizona sun was already brutal, glinting off the pale stone of the house in blinding sheets of light. I parked in the driveway and walked to the front door with measured steps. My posture was straight, my expression calm. I had slept well the night before, genuinely well, for the first time since this nightmare began. There's a particular peace that comes from having a plan. Vanessa opened the door, and I watched her face cycle through several emotions in rapid succession. Surprise first, then confusion, then a flicker of something that might have been concern. She had expected me broken by now, desperate and pleading. Instead, she found a woman who looked like she'd eaten a good breakfast and taken time to press her blouse. Claire. She recovered quickly, her expression settling into the polite mask she wore for company. "We weren't expecting you. I thought I would stop by," I said pleasantly. "There are some things I need to review before Saturday's deadline." She hesitated, clearly recalculating. I could almost see the gears turning behind her eyes. Was this surrender? Or something else? Ultimately, greed won over caution. She stepped aside to let me enter. "Ethan," she called over her shoulder, "your mother's here." My son appeared from the kitchen, looking tired and uncertain. His eyes met mine for just a moment before sliding away. Whatever internal battle he was fighting, it had cost him sleep. I settled into a chair at the dining room table and placed my briefcase beside me. I'd like to see all the financial documents related to my accounts. Bank statements, credit applications, tax filings, everything. If I'm going to sign the house over, I need to understand exactly where things stand. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly, but she couldn't refuse without revealing that something was wrong. "Of course," she said smoothly. "Ethan, get the file box from the office." Ethan disappeared and returned with a large cardboard box filled with folders. He set it on the table without comment, then retreated to stand near the window, arms crossed, watching. I began to review the documents methodically, the way I had reviewed thousands of case files during my career. Bank statements going back 3 years, credit card bills, investment summaries. I made notes in my small notebook, asking occasional questions that Vanessa answered with growing impatience. She thought I was stalling, wasting her time with an old woman's excessive caution. She had no idea what I was actually looking for. I found it in the 4th folder, a credit application dated 8 months ago, opened in my name, bearing a signature that was almost, but not quite my own. The loops were too tight, the pressure too consistent. Whoever had signed this document had practiced my signature carefully, but not carefully enough to fool someone who had spent 3 decades analyzing fraudulent documents. I kept my expression neutral and continued reviewing. 2 more applications surfaced, with the same telltale forgery. Different dates, different amounts. Same full signature. Vanessa had been methodical. She had built a paper trail of debt in my name over the course of months. Each document a small crime that added up to something much larger. "I'll need copies of these," I said, gesturing to the stack I'd assembled. "For my records." Vanessa frowned. "Why? You'll have access to everything once the transfer is complete." "Humor an old woman," I said mildly. "I like to keep things organized." She rolled her eyes but pointed toward the home office. "The copier's in there. Ethan, show her." Ethan led me to the small office at the back of the house. As the copier hummed to life, warming up for its task, he glanced toward the door. Vanessa had not followed us. I could hear her footsteps in the kitchen, the clatter of dishes being moved. "Mom!" Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you okay?" I looked at my son, really looked at him, for the first time since this ordeal began. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked like a man who had been holding his breath for years and was slowly suffocating. "Are you?" I asked quietly. Before he could answer, Vanessa's footsteps approached. Ethan's expression closed like a door slamming shut. He stepped back, creating distance, becoming once again the silent figure who stood behind his wife and said nothing. But I had seen it, that flash of something real beneath the fear. My son was still in there somewhere. Trapped, but not gone. I made copies of every forged document plus a dozen others for cover. The evidence slid into my briefcase with satisfying weight. This was no longer speculation or suspicion. This was proof. Tangible, documentable, prosecutable. Vanessa met me at the front door, her arms crossed. "Saturday, Claire. That's today. I expect those papers signed and delivered by noon." I paused with my hand on the doorknob. "I understand," I said. And I did, better than she could possibly imagine. The drive to Rachel's office took 25 minutes. I walked into her reception area carrying a briefcase full of evidence. Forged signatures, fraudulent credit applications, documentation of identity theft spanning nearly a year. Rachel met me with eager anticipation. "Tell me you found something." I set the briefcase on her desk and opened it. 3 forged signatures on credit applications, clear evidence of fraud. Rachel examined the documents with a trained eye, nodding slowly. "This is exactly what we needed." She paused, looking up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "But Claire, there's something else, something I found while you were gone." She pulled a file from her desk drawer, old and slightly yellowed, with a case number stamped on the tab. I dug deeper into the Sullivan inheritance dispute, Vanessa's stepfather. The pattern isn't just similar to what she's doing to you. She opened the file and slid it toward me. It's identical. The Sullivan file sat between us on Rachel's desk, its contents spread like evidence at a crime scene. Richard Sullivan had been a successful financial advisor, widowed, remarried late in life to a woman with a college-age daughter. After his wife died of a sudden stroke, he grew increasingly dependent on his stepdaughter, the only family he had left. When he died 4 years later, his entire estate went to Vanessa. His biological brother received nothing and filed a complaint alleging undue influence. The case was dismissed for insufficient evidence. The parallels were unmistakable. Isolation of the target. Financial control established gradually. Family members excluded or marginalized. Assets transferred just before or after a crisis. Vanessa had followed the same playbook with her stepfather that she was now using on me. The only difference was that this time, someone was watching. "We need to move carefully," Rachel said, gathering the Sullivan documents back into their folder. "We have evidence of fraud, but evidence alone doesn't win. We need her to convict herself." Over the next 2 hours, we designed what Rachel called the trap document. On its surface, it appeared to be a standard legal form, a voluntary transfer acknowledgement, the kind of paperwork that accompanies any significant property transaction. It would confirm that I, Claire Montgomery, was willingly transferring ownership of my house to my son Ethan and his wife Vanessa, exactly what they had been demanding. But buried in the dense legal language was a clause that changed everything. By signing as a witness to my voluntary transfer, Vanessa would be certifying, under penalty of perjury, that she had no knowledge of any coercion, pressure, or undue influence being applied to me. She would be swearing in her own handwriting that I was acting freely. Rachel walked me through the mechanism with the patience of a teacher explaining a complex equation. When she signs this, she's making a legal declaration that no coercion occurred. But we have recordings of her threatening you, demanding you sign, using your credit without permission, We have evidence of forgery, fraud, identity theft." She tapped the document with one finger. "Her signature on this form becomes proof of a false statement. She'll be certifying something she knows isn't true. That's perjury, Claire, a felony." The beauty of the trap was its simplicity. Vanessa would see what she expected to see, a defeated old woman finally surrendering. She would sign without reading carefully, too confident in her victory to notice the language that would seal her fate. Her own arrogance would be the weapon that destroyed her. But for the trap to work, I had to play my part convincingly. Rachel spent hours coaching me on body language and word choice. I had to appear broken, shoulders slumped, voice hesitant, eyes avoiding contact. I had to let Vanessa believe she had won completely, that I was signing under duress, not because I had a plan, but because I had no other choice. "Overconfidence makes people careless," Rachel reminded me. "She needs to feel so certain of victory that she doesn't bother to read the fine print. Your job is to give her that certainty." It was strange, preparing to deceive my own daughter-in-law. I had spent my career catching liars, not becoming one. But David's voice echoed in my memory, his warning about Vanessa, his preparation for this exact moment. He had known that sometimes protection requires deception. I was simply finishing what he'd started. While we prepared the trap, Rachel continued digging into Vanessa's background. "The Sullivan name keeps coming up in old case files," she told me on the third day, her brow furrowed with concentration. "Complaints that went nowhere. Suspicions that were never proven. There's a pattern here, Claire. I can feel it. I just haven't found the thread that ties it all together yet." She promised results within days. I trusted her thoroughness. On the evening of the 7th day, as I sat in my hotel room reviewing the trap document one final time, my phone buzzed with a text message. The sender was Ethan. "Mom, we need to talk. Alone. Please." I stared at the screen for a long time, reading those 7 words over and over. There was no explanation, no context, no indication of what my son wanted to discuss. The message could mean anything: a warning, a confession, another manipulation orchestrated by Vanessa. Or perhaps, and I hardly dared to hope, a genuine reaching out from the son I'd raised, the boy who used to hold my hand, crossing busy streets. I thought about his whispered question in the office while Vanessa was in the kitchen, a flash of genuine concern in his eyes before he retreated back into silence. The way his hands had gripped the chair that first morning, knuckles white with tension. Was that fear of me or fear of her? David had always believed there was good in Ethan, even after Vanessa entered his life. "He's lost," he'd told me once, "but not gone. People can find their way back if someone leaves a light on for them." I typed my response slowly, weighing each word. "Tomorrow morning, 9. The coffee shop on Desert Ridge. Come alone." His reply came instantly. "I will. Thank you." I set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow I would sit across from my son and discover which version of him would appear. The man Vanessa had molded, or the boy David and I had raised. The meeting could be a trap. It could be salvation. I wouldn't know until I walked through that door. But I would go, because if there was even a chance that my son was reaching for help, I had to be there to take his hand. The coffee shop was too exposed. Ethan texted me early the next morning with a change of location. A parking structure on the edge of downtown. 3rd level, far corner. "Safer," he wrote. "Please understand." I understood better than he knew. A man afraid of being watched chooses shadows over sunlight. I arrived 15 minutes early and parked facing the entrance ramp, where I could see anyone coming or going. The structure was nearly empty at this hour. Most of the city still finishing breakfast or commuting to work. Concrete pillars cast long shadows in the fluorescent light. The air smelled of exhaust and dust. Ethan's car appeared at exactly 9. He pulled into a space 3 rows away from mine and sat for a moment before getting out, checking his mirrors, scanning the empty lanes around him. When he finally walked toward me, I barely recognized my own son. His face was gaunt, dark circles carved beneath his eyes like bruises. His hands trembled as he shoved them into his coat pockets. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. Or perhaps years. Mom. His voice cracked on the single syllable. He glanced over his shoulder, then again, as if expecting someone to materialize from the shadows. I can't stay long. She tracks my phone. I told her I was going to the hardware store. Sit down, son. I gestured to the passenger seat of my car. We can talk inside. He hesitated, then climbed in and closed the door with exaggerated care, as though even that small sound might betray him. For a long moment, we sat in silence. I waited. In 30 years of interviewing witnesses, I had learned that patience often yields more than questions. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I've wanted to tell you for so long, Mom, but I couldn't. I was afraid. I'm still afraid. Tell me what? The dam broke. Words poured out of him in a rush, tumbling over each other like water through a cracked wall. He told me about the marriage, how it had changed after the first year, how Vanessa's charm had slowly transformed into control. She managed their finances exclusively. He didn't even know the passwords to their bank accounts. She scheduled his time, monitored his calls, decided which friends he could see and which had to be dropped. She had isolated him so gradually that he didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. When I try to disagree with her, she threatens to leave and take the girls, Ethan said, his voice breaking. She says she'll tell the court I'm an unfit father. She has recordings, Mom, recordings of me losing my temper during arguments she provoked. Out of context, they sound terrible, like I'm dangerous. He pressed his palms against his eyes. I'm not dangerous. I've never hurt anyone. But who would believe me over her? I thought of Vanessa's smooth confidence, her ability to shape any situation to her advantage. I thought of how easily she had dismissed me as a confused old woman. She was skilled at constructing narratives that served her purposes. If she had spent years gathering ammunition against Ethan, she would know exactly how to use it. From Strong M, "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" I asked gently. Because she was watching. She's always watching. Ethan looked at me with eyes that held years of accumulated fear. And because I was ashamed. You and Dad raised me to be strong, to protect my family. Instead, I let her take over everything. I let her treat you like garbage, and I stood there and said nothing. You were protecting your children, I said. That takes a different kind of courage. Ethan shook his head, but I reached over and took his hand. His fingers were cold, trembling. I believe you, son, and I'm proud that you came to me now. His eyes filled with tears. For a moment, he was the boy I remembered, vulnerable, earnest, desperate to do the right thing, but unsure how. Mom, I know things about her, things I can't say yet. He met my gaze with an intensity I hadn't seen in years. But when the time comes, I'll do what I have to do. I promise. I didn't push for details. Whatever Ethan was holding back, he would reveal when he was ready. Pressing too hard might shatter the fragile trust we were rebuilding. Where was I? Ethan said, glancing at his watch with rising panic. She's planning something. I don't know what, but she's been making calls late at night, talking to people I don't recognize. She wants those house papers signed immediately. She keeps saying the timeline has moved up. He opened the car door, preparing to flee back to his controlled existence. Be careful, Mom. She's more dangerous than you know. He was gone before I could respond, his car disappearing down the ramp with desperate speed. I sat alone in the empty structure, processing everything my son had revealed. He was a prisoner in his own marriage, trapped by threats and manipulation, unable to escape without risking his children. And yet he'd come to me, despite the fear, despite the surveillance. He had reached out. My phone rang an hour later, just as I was pulling into the hotel parking lot. Rachel's name appeared on the screen. Claire. Her voice was tight with barely contained excitement. I found it, the connection I've been looking for. What connection? Vanessa has done this before, not just to her stepfather. There's more. And the victim's brother is still alive. His name is Thomas Sullivan, and he's been waiting years for someone to believe him. Seeing his pictures made me wary the next day when I told him he was dead, and the memory seemed to block the wheel. So, how was this going to happen? Now he was alive, reachable, and apparently eager to talk. Rachel met me at the door of her office with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was the look of a hunter who has finally cornered prey that has eluded her for years. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "This is going to take a while." She had spent the past week digging deeper into Vanessa's history than any previous investigator had bothered to go. What she found transformed everything I thought I understood about my daughter-in-law. Vanessa Sullivan wasn't always Vanessa Hale. Before she married Ethan, before she ever met my family, there was Richard Sullivan, her stepfather. I knew the basic outline. Vanessa's mother had married Richard when Vanessa was in college, and Richard had died about 6 years ago. But I'd never thought much about it. Stepfathers died. Estates were settled. Life moved on. Rachel shook her head slowly. Richard Sullivan was a retired financial advisor, worth nearly $3 million when he died. He had built a successful practice, sold it, and invested the proceeds wisely. He should have lived comfortably for another 20 years. She pulled out a photograph, an elderly man with kind eyes and silver hair, standing in front of a modest house in Scottsdale. This is him, 4 years before his death. Healthy, sharp, independent. What happened? Vanessa's mother died suddenly, when Vanessa was 23. Heart attack, completely unexpected. Richard was devastated. He genuinely loved his wife, and Vanessa was the only family he had left. Rachel's voice hardened. So he took her in, treated her like a daughter, trusted her completely. The story that followed was sickeningly familiar. After her mother's death, Vanessa moved into Richard's home to help him through his grief. Gradually, she took over his finances, his schedule, his social connections. Old friends stopped visiting. His brother Thomas's calls went unanswered. When Thomas drove across the state to check on Richard, Vanessa met him at the door and said Richard was too tired for visitors. Within 3 years, Richard had changed his will entirely. His brother, the man he'd been close to his entire life, was removed. Everything went to Vanessa. And 2 years after that, Richard died in his sleep. Natural causes, according to the coroner. But Thomas didn't believe it. He filed a complaint with Adult Protective Services, Rachel continued, pulling out a copy of the complaint, claiming Vanessa had manipulated Richard during his final years, isolated him from family, controlled his finances, pressured him to change his will. She slid the document toward me, pages of detailed allegations, date-specific incidents. The case was investigated but ultimately dismissed. Insufficient evidence. Vanessa had been careful. She knew exactly how to cover her tracks. I stared at the documents, feeling the shape of the pattern emerge like a photograph developing in solution. The same techniques, the same timeline, the same methodical destruction of an elderly man's autonomy and resources. Vanessa hadn't invented her approach. For me, she had refined it over years of practice. "She's a predator," I said quietly, "a serial predator." Rachel nodded. "She targets older people with assets. She isolates them from support systems, friends, family, anyone who might intervene. She gains financial control through manipulation and forgery. And when they die or become incapacitated, she inherits everything." She met my eyes. "You're not her first victim, Claire. You're her latest. And if we hadn't caught this, you wouldn't have been her last." The realization hit me like a physical blow. All this time, I had thought of Vanessa as greedy, an opportunist who saw a chance and took it. But this was something far darker. This was calculated predation, honed over years, perfected through repetition. She had destroyed Richard Sullivan the same way she was trying to destroy me, and she had gotten away with it. "What about Thomas?" I asked. "You said he wants to help?" Rachel's expression softened slightly. "I called him yesterday. When I explained your situation, the similarities to what happened to his brother, he broke down crying. He said he'd been waiting years for someone to believe him." She handed me a phone number written on a small piece of paper. "He's willing to testify, provide documents, do whatever it takes. He said if there's any chance of exposing what Vanessa really is, he'll be on the next plane to Arizona." I held the paper carefully, as though it were something precious. Thomas Sullivan had spent 6 years living with the knowledge that his brother had been exploited and destroyed, unable to prove it, unable to find justice. Now he had a second chance, and so did I. "If we can connect these two cases," Rachel said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "Vanessa won't just lose your money, she'll lose her freedom." Pattern evidence is powerful in court. 2 victims with identical experiences, identical methods, identical outcomes. That's not coincidence. That's criminal enterprise. I thought of Richard Sullivan, the kind-eyed man in the photograph, trusting his stepdaughter until she hollowed him out and discarded what remained. I thought of myself, nearly following the same path, and I thought of whoever might come after me if Vanessa wasn't stopped. "Call Thomas," I said. "Tell him I want to speak with him personally, and then let's finish building that trap." The call with Thomas Sullivan lasted 3 hours. His voice carried the weight of 6 years of grief and frustration, punctuated by moments of fierce determination. He told me everything: how Richard had changed in his final years, how Vanessa had systematically severed his connections to family and friends, how Thomas had watched helplessly from across the state as his brother disappeared into isolation. By the end of our conversation, I felt as though I had known Richard personally. In many ways, I had. His story was becoming mine. Rachel and I spent the following day finalizing our strategy. The trap document was ready. Thomas was preparing to fly to Arizona. The recordings, the forged signatures, the evidence of credit fraud, everything was organized, documented, waiting to be deployed. All we needed was for Vanessa to take the bait. She came to me the next evening. I was sitting in my hotel room reviewing notes when the knock came. Not the polite tap of housekeeping or the tentative knock of a stranger. This was sharp, impatient, demanding. I knew who it was before I opened the door. Vanessa stood in the corridor, her coat still on, her expression carved from ice. She didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed past me into the room and turned, arms crossed, eyes blazing. "I'm done waiting, Claire." Her voice cut through the stale hotel air. "Sign the papers. Today, not tomorrow, not next week, right now." I let my shoulders sag just as Rachel had coached me. I shuffled to the small desk by the window, moving like a woman whose joints ached and whose spirit had finally cracked. "Vanessa, please, I just need a little more time to—" "Time?" She laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "You've had plenty of time. You've been hiding in this pathetic room for 2 weeks, pretending you have options." She stepped closer and I could smell her perfume, something expensive, probably purchased with money that belonged to someone else. "Let me be clear about what happens if you don't sign." She pulled out her phone and showed me a document on the screen, a guardianship petition. My name was already filled in. "I've consulted with an attorney," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "If you don't cooperate, I'll file this tomorrow. You'll be declared mentally incompetent. The court will appoint a guardian to manage your affairs. And guess who that guardian will be?" She smiled, showing too many teeth. "Courts love concerned daughters-in-law, Claire. They believe us when we talk about our poor, confused, elderly relatives who can't manage their own finances. I've done it before. I can do it again. I've done it before." The words hung in the air between us. Confirmation of everything Rachel and Thomas had told me. Vanessa wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Her arrogance had grown so complete that she saw no need for pretense. I let my hands tremble as I reached for the edge of the desk. I let my voice crack when I spoke. "You would really do that? Take away my ability to make my own decisions?" In a heartbeat, she checked her watch with theatrical impatience. "So what's it gonna be? Sign now, or spend your remaining years with me controlling every aspect of your life. Your money, your home, your medical care, all of it, mine to decide." I closed my eyes, counting to 5, making sure my performance was convincing. When I opened them, I let her see defeat. Total, abject surrender. "Fine," I whispered. "You win. I'll sign tomorrow morning. Just let me have one more night in peace, please." Vanessa's expression transformed. The hard lines of anger softened into triumph. She had won. The old woman was broken. Tomorrow morning, she would have everything she wanted. "Tomorrow morning," she repeated, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. 9 o'clock, at the house. Don't be late, and don't try anything clever. You're not smart enough to outmaneuver me." She swept out of the room without a backward glance, already composing victory in her mind. The door clicked shut behind her. I stood motionless until I heard her car start in the parking lot, until the sound of the engine faded into the desert night. Then I straightened my spine and allowed myself a small smile. She had no idea what was coming. I moved to the desk, where I had hidden David's sealed envelope tucked beneath a stack of newspapers. The cream-colored paper felt fragile in my hands, precious with the weight of everything it represented. Rachel had told me to wait for the right moment. This was it. I opened the envelope carefully, preserving every fold. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in David's elegant handwriting, and something small and metallic that clinked against my palm. A brass key, old-fashioned, with the number 347 etched into its surface. The letter was brief. David had never wasted words. "My love, if you're reading this, I was right about her. And sorry I couldn't be there to fight beside you, but I've done what I could." The key opened safe deposit box 347 at Valley National Bank. "What's inside will speak for me when I cannot. Stand tall, Claire. You are stronger than you know. All my love, forever, David." I read the words 3 times, hearing his voice in every syllable. He had prepared for this battle, knowing he wouldn't live to see it. He had armed me with weapons I didn't know existed, timed to arrive at the moment I needed them most. I closed my fingers around the key and held it against my heart. Whatever David had left in that box, he meant for it to be opened now. When the trap was set and the predator was walking confidently toward her own destruction. Tomorrow morning, I would retrieve David's final gift. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into that house and let Vanessa believe she had won. And tomorrow morning, everything would change. I slept little that night, but the hours of wakefulness were not spent in worry. I lay in the darkness of the hotel room, turning David's key over in my fingers, feeling its weight and texture. He had carried this key to the bank, had placed something precious inside that metal box, had sealed it with his initials, and left it waiting for a moment he would never see. I owed it to him to finish what he'd started. Valley National Bank opened at 8. I was waiting at the door when the security guard unlocked it, my identification ready, the brass key warming my palm. The bank officer who greeted me was a young woman with a professional smile and patient eyes. She didn't ask questions when I presented my documents and requested access to safe deposit box 347. She simply led me through the lobby, past the teller windows, and into the vault. The box was smaller than I expected, perhaps 8 inches wide, 10 inches long. The officer inserted her key. I inserted mine, and the mechanism clicked open with a sound like a whispered secret. Inside was a metal container, about the size of a jewelry box, sealed with tape that bore David's initials in permanent marker. He had wanted no doubt about who had placed it there. I lifted the container carefully, feeling its modest weight. Whatever was inside, David had deemed it important enough to protect with layers of security and secrecy. I wanted to open it immediately to hear his voice one more time through whatever message he'd left. But Rachel's instructions echoed in my mind. The right moment, when Vanessa was watching, I drove directly to Rachel's office. She met me in the reception area, her eyes immediately fixing on the container in my hands. "You found it," she said softly. "Okay, so point, box 347, just like the letter said." She took the container with something approaching reverence, turning it over to examine David's initials on the seal. "He told me about this, 3 months before he died. Something that would speak for him when he couldn't speak for himself." And Rachel looked up at me. "He never told me what was inside. He said you would know when to open it, when Vanessa was watching." And we agreed to wait. The confrontation was less than an hour away. Whatever David had prepared, its impact would be greatest with an audience. And at 9 precisely, I pulled into the driveway of Ethan's house. The winter sun was bright but gave no warmth, reflecting off the pale stone in blinding sheets of light. In my hands, I carried a manila folder containing the voluntary transfer acknowledgement, the trap document Rachel and I had crafted so carefully. Down the street, parked inconspicuously near the corner, Rachel waited in her car with the sealed container on the seat beside her. Ethan opened the door before I could knock. His face was pale, his movements stiff. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Fear, certainly, but something else underneath, something that might have been hope. "Mom," he said quietly, "you came. I said I would." Vanessa appeared behind him, practically vibrating with anticipation. She wore a sharp blazer and pearls, as though she'd dressed for a celebration. Her smile was wide and predatory. "Claire, right on time." She stepped aside to let me enter. "I knew you'd come around eventually. They always do." I shuffled into the dining room where we had sat so many times for family dinners, back when David was alive and the house still felt like home. The same table where Vanessa had first placed the property transfer documents now waited, empty, a pen lying beside a crystal paperweight. I placed the manila folder on the table and slid it toward her. "The documents you wanted." Vanessa snatched the folder without hesitation. She didn't read it. She was too eager, too confident in her victory. Her eyes scanned only for signature lines, which she found easily thanks to the colored tabs I'd placed. She grabbed the pen and began signing with aggressive strokes, initialing each page. Her handwriting sharp and impatient. Ethan watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable, his hands hanging at his sides. When she finished, Vanessa slammed the pen down with theatrical finality. Finally, she gathered the papers against her chest like a trophy. "The house is ours, all of it." She looked at me with undisguised contempt. "You should have signed weeks ago, Claire. Would have saved yourself a lot of trouble." I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, for 3 heartbeats, then 4, and then, slowly, I straightened. The defeated posture I had worn for weeks fell away like a shed skin. My shoulders squared, my spine aligned. My chin lifted. I looked at Vanessa with the calm, focused expression I had worn in 100 courtrooms, facing 100 fraudsters who thought they were smarter than everyone else. "Actually, Vanessa," I said quietly, "you just signed a confession." Her smile froze. The triumphant gleam in her eyes flickered and dimmed. For the first time since I had known her, Vanessa Crawford Hale looked uncertain. "What are you talking about?" I picked up the documents Vanessa had just signed and held them where she could see the pages clearly. "This form is called a voluntary transfer acknowledgement. You were so eager to sign that you didn't bother to read it. I turned to a specific page and pointed to a paragraph buried in the legal language. This clause right here? You certified, under penalty of perjury, that no coercion or pressure was involved in any property transactions between us. From the paragraph, Vanessa's eyes darted to the paragraph, scanning the words she had ignored in her rush to victory. I watched the color drain from her face as comprehension dawned. You certified, under penalty of perjury, that no coercion or pressure was involved in any property transactions between us. Recordings of you demanding I sign over the house or be thrown out of my own home. Recordings of you admitting that you used my credit history without permission. I set the documents down gently, almost tenderly. By signing this form, you certified something you knew was false. That's not just fraud. That's perjury, a felony. Her mouth opened and closed several times before words emerged. Those recordings, you can't use those. I didn't consent. It's illegal. Arizona is a one-party consent state, I said. I was a party to every conversation. Every recording is admissible. Vanessa's composure cracked. The polished mask she had worn for years began to splinter, revealing something desperate and ugly underneath. She spun toward Ethan, her voice rising to a pitch I had never heard before. Tell her she's wrong. Tell your mother she's crazy. Tell her this is illegal and it won't hold up, and she's just a confused old woman who doesn't know what she's talking about. Ethan didn't move toward her. He stood in the doorway where he'd been watching, his posture different than I'd seen in years. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted, his eyes clear and steady. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. I've been recording too, Vanessa. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Vanessa froze. For 8 months, Ethan continued, his voice stronger and more certain than I'd heard it since before his marriage. Every threat you made against me, every manipulation, every lie you told about my mother, every time you threatened to take the girls if I didn't obey. He held up the phone, its screen displaying a folder labeled with dates spanning nearly a year. I have everything, hundreds of hours of evidence. Vanessa's face went white, truly white, the blood draining so completely that she looked almost translucent. You were supposed to be on my side, she whispered. You promised. You swore you would always. I was protecting my children, Ethan said, from you. The front door opened behind me. Rachel walked in, carrying a laptop under one arm and the sealed metal container from the safe deposit box in her hand. She moved past Vanessa without acknowledgement, setting up the laptop on the dining room table with calm efficiency. There's one more thing you need to see, Vanessa. Rachel opened the container, revealing a USB drive nestled in protective foam. She inserted it into the laptop and clicked a file. Something David left specifically for this moment. The screen flickered to life. And there he was, David. He was sitting in the study of our home, the room where he'd spent so many hours during his final months. The afternoon light fell across his face, highlighting the hollows that illness had carved beneath his cheekbones. He was thin, thinner than I remembered, thinner than I had allowed myself to remember. But his eyes burned with the fierce determination I had fallen in love with 42 years ago. Hello, Claire. His voice was weaker than I remembered, but steady. If you're watching this, it means I was right, and I'm so sorry I couldn't be there to fight beside you. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I could only watch as my husband, my David, spoke to me from beyond the grave. Vanessa, I know you're watching this too. His eyes seemed to look directly through the screen, directly at the woman who had tried to destroy me. I've seen how you look at my wife, not with love or even tolerance, with calculation. I've watched you separate her from friends, from family, from everyone who might protect her when I'm gone. I recognized what you were doing because I spent 40 years working with people's finances. I learned to spot manipulators early. He paused, You're not as clever as you think." Vanessa made a sound, something between a gasp and a moan. "I've documented everything," David continued. "Every suspicious transaction. Every forged signature I discovered after the fact. Every step you took to isolate Claire and gain control of our assets. I've left this evidence with people I trust, to be used when the time is right." He paused, and something softened in his expression. "Claire, my love, I know this must be overwhelming. I know you're probably crying right now, because you always did cry at sentimental parts of movies, even when you thought I wasn't looking." A sound escaped my throat, half laugh, half sob. He was right. Tears were streaming down my face. "I couldn't protect you in person, but I've done everything I could to protect you from beyond. Stand tall, my love. You are stronger than you know, and I will love you forever, across whatever distance separates us." His smile, that familiar, gentle smile, filled the screen one last time. "Give them hell, Claire, for both of us." The screen went dark. Silence filled the room, the kind of silence that follows an earthquake, when the world is still deciding whether it will hold together or fall apart. I wept, not from sadness, from the overwhelming presence of my husband's love, reaching across death itself to shield me. He had known. He had prepared. He had fought for me with his dying breath and beyond. Vanessa stood frozen, her aberrant plans crumbling around her like a sand castle meeting the tide. She had thought herself so clever, so unstoppable. But David had seen through her from the very beginning. She never had a chance. Rachel reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick document, placing it on the table with deliberate care. "This is the formal report to Adult Protective Services and the District Attorney. It contains all evidence of elder financial exploitation, identity theft, fraud, forgery, and perjury. It's being filed today." She paused, letting the words sink in. "And there's one more thing you should know, Vanessa. Thomas Sullivan, Richard's brother, is ready to testify about everything you did to him, about the pattern that connects his case to Claire's." Okay, Vanessa's legs seemed to give way. She caught herself on the edge of the table, knuckles white, breathing in short, sharp gasps. "This is the end," Rachel said quietly. "Not just of what you tried to do to Claire, but of everything you've been doing for years. It ends today." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Rachel had prepared for this moment with thoroughness I had come to expect from her. Within minutes of the confrontation ending, she was on the phone with her contacts at Adult Protective Services and the District Attorney's Office, describing the evidence we had gathered and arranging for immediate filing. Vanessa remained in the house, though she had retreated to the living room and refused to speak or make eye contact with anyone. She sat on the couch with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at nothing. The confident predator who had walked into this room an hour ago had vanished, replaced by something smaller and more desperate. I felt no sympathy. I thought of Richard Sullivan, of the years she had stolen from him, of the brother who had grieved alone, without justice. Vanessa had earned whatever was coming. By early afternoon, Rachel returned from the courthouse with news that made me close my eyes in relief. A judge had reviewed the emergency petition and issued a protective order with immediate effect. Vanessa was prohibited from contacting me in any form, from accessing any accounts connected to my name, and from entering any property I owned or resided in. Her name was being removed from every financial document she had fraudulently attached herself to. The credit accounts she had opened using my identity were frozen pending investigation. Her power, built over years of manipulation and theft, evaporated in a single afternoon. The detectives arrived at 6. There were 2 of them, a man and a woman, both wearing the patient expressions of professionals who had seen every kind of criminal and were no longer surprised by any of it. They asked for Vanessa by name and explained that the district attorney's office had some questions they hoped she could help answer. "Am I under arrest?" Vanessa's voice cracked on the question. "Not at this time, ma'am. This is voluntary, but we strongly encourage you to come with us and clarify a few things. It would be better for everyone if you cooperated." The female detective's tone was polite, but carried an undercurrent of steel. Vanessa looked around the room, at Ethan, who wouldn't meet her eyes, at me, standing beside Rachel with my arms crossed, at the documents spread across the table that documented her crimes in meticulous detail. For a moment, I thought she might refuse. Then something in her seemed to collapse. She reached for her coat. "Fine, I'll answer your questions. This is all a misunderstanding that I can easily explain." She walked out between the two detectives, her chin lifted in defiance that no longer convinced anyone. As the door closed behind her, I heard the female detective mention Richard Sullivan's name. Vanessa's step faltered, almost imperceptibly. Vanessa did not expect that. She had thought her stepfather's case was buried and forgotten. She was about to learn otherwise, and Thomas Sullivan arrived in Arizona the following day. Rachel met him at the airport and brought him directly to the district attorney's office, where investigators were already building a case that would connect Vanessa's treatment of me to her treatment of Richard. Thomas was 68 years old, silver-haired and soft-spoken, but there was iron in his spine. He had waited 6 years for someone to believe him about his brother's exploitation. Now he had a chance to see justice done, and he was not going to waste it. I met him briefly that afternoon in a conference room at Rachel's office. He took my hands in both of his and looked at me with eyes that held both gratitude and grief. "You stopped her," Thomas said. "You stopped her from doing to you what she did to Richard." His voice wavered. "My brother was a good man. He deserved better than what she gave him. And now, because of you, maybe the truth will finally come out." "David deserves the credit," I said. "He saw what Vanessa was before anyone else did. He prepared for this fight even while he was dying." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then your husband was a remarkable man. I wish I could have met him." "He would have liked you," I said, and I meant it. The investigation into Richard Sullivan's case was formally reopened that week. With the pattern evidence from my situation, the identical methods, the identical timeline, the identical outcome, prosecutors had grounds to re-examine everything about his final years, the circumstances of his estate transfer. Thomas finally had hope that his brother's exploitation would be officially acknowledged, that his memory would be honored with truth instead of buried under Vanessa's lies. That evening, after the detectives had taken Vanessa away and Rachel had left to file the final documents, Ethan and I stood alone in the house where he had lived with his wife. The house that had once been filled with her controlling presence now felt strangely empty, as though a storm had passed and left only silence in its wake. Ethan hadn't spoken much since the confrontation. He had watched everything unfold with an expression that shifted between relief, guilt, and something that might have been hope. Now, in the quiet of the empty living room, the weight of years seemed to crash down on him all at once. "Mom," his voice broke on the single syllable. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." And then he was in my arms, sobbing against my shoulder, the way he had when he was a small boy, frightened by thunderstorms. I held him tight, feeling his body shake with the release of years of suppressed guilt and fear. "I should have been stronger," he gasped between sobs. "I should have protected you. I should have stopped her years ago. Instead, I stood there and let her." "You did protect me," I said firmly. "Those recordings you made, 8 months of evidence. You were gathering weapons even when you were terrified of what she might do." I pulled back and took his face in my hands, forcing him to meet my eyes. You were strong when it mattered, Ethan. That's all I needed. That's all I ever needed. He shook his head, tears still streaming down his cheeks. Dad would be so ashamed of me. No. My voice was fierce. Your father would be proud of you. You found your courage when it counted. You stood up for your children and for me. That took more strength than you know. We held each other for a long time, father and son reunited. Two people who had nearly been destroyed by the same predator but had survived to stand together in the wreckage of her schemes. The house was quiet around us, but it was no longer the silence of oppression. It was the silence of aftermath, of battles won, of new beginnings waiting to take root. Now the healing begins, I whispered, holding my son close, for both of us. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. 1 month after Vanessa was taken in for questioning, I unlocked the front door of my house and stepped inside for the first time since the nightmare began. The air was still and cool. No one had adjusted the thermostat in weeks. But as I walked through the rooms, something began to shift. The walls I had touched 10,000 times welcomed my hands back. The furniture David and I had chosen together seemed to settle more comfortably on the floors. The photographs on the mantel, our wedding day, Ethan's graduation, the granddaughter's births, looked back at me with familiar warmth instead of accusation. I stood in the kitchen, where Vanessa had first told me about the Lexus, where she had placed those property transfer documents with such cold confidence. The memory no longer carried the sting it once had. This was my home, mine and David's. No one could take that from me now. I walked to the study, where David had recorded his final message, and I sat in his chair. The afternoon light fell across the desk exactly as it had in the video, and I could almost feel his presence beside me. Not as grief, that sharp, cutting thing that had defined my first year without him, but as warmth, as comfort, as the knowledge that love does not end with death, that it can reach across the divide and continue to protect, to guide, to save. Ethan filed for divorce 4 days after the confrontation. The proceedings moved with surprising speed given the circumstances. His recordings, 8 months of documented psychological abuse, threats, and manipulation painted a picture that even the most skeptical judge could not ignore. Combined with Vanessa's ongoing criminal investigation, the custody battle was remarkably brief. Ethan received primary custody of both girls. Vanessa was granted supervised visitation, contingent on her avoiding incarceration. Given the charges she faced, the conditions seemed increasingly unlikely to be met. The district attorney's office was building a comprehensive case. Rachel kept me informed of the progress, though she cautioned that legal proceedings move slowly, and I should prepare for months of waiting. The current charges under consideration included elder financial exploitation, identity theft, forgery, fraud, and perjury. Each count carried significant penalties. If the Richard Sullivan investigation yielded additional evidence, and Thomas was working tirelessly to ensure it did, more charges could follow. Vanessa's attorney was reportedly attempting to negotiate a plea deal, though the DA seemed disinclined to offer generous terms. Pattern offenders rarely received sympathy from prosecutors. 3 weeks after returning home, I flew to Scottsdale to meet Thomas Sullivan in person. He lived in a modest house on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by desert landscape and the kind of silence that invites reflection. He met me at the door with tears already forming in his eyes, and embraced me like a long-lost sister. His living room was filled with photographs of Richard. I saw him as a young man, confident and smiling, as a middle-aged financial advisor accepting an award, as an elderly gentleman with kind eyes, the same photograph Rachel had shown me weeks ago. Thomas told me stories about him, his generosity, his humor, his love of gardening and old movies, He told me about the brother he had lost twice, first to Vanessa's isolation, then to death. No one believed me, he said, his voice thick with years of accumulated grief. I told everyone who would listen that something was wrong, that Richard would never have cut me out of his life, that she was doing something to him. But no one listened. They said I was bitter about the inheritance. They said I was imagining things. I took his hand. I believe you, and now, because of what happened to me, other people will believe you too. He wept then, deep sobs of relief that seemed to release years of tension from his shoulders. When he finally composed himself, he looked at me with gratitude I had not earned alone. Your brother helped save me, I told him. His story connected the dots. Without the pattern he established, we might not have had enough to stop her. Thomas smiled through his tears. He would have liked knowing that. He always wanted to help people. I flew home the next day, carrying a photograph Thomas had given me. Richard in his garden, holding a tomato he had grown himself, grinning with simple pride. I placed it on my mantle, beside the pictures of my own family. He belonged there now. His story and mine were intertwined. Ethan and the girls began visiting regularly. Sunday dinners became our tradition, the way they had been when David was alive. I would cook simple meals, nothing fancy, and the granddaughters would set the table with the good china that had gathered dust for too long. They called me Grandma and asked for stories about Grandpa David, and I told them everything I could remember. How he laughed, how he worked, how he loved without reservation and protected without hesitation. Ethan was learning to be his own man again. I watched him rediscover confidence he had buried years ago, watched him make decisions without looking over his shoulder for approval. He was not the same person he had been before Vanessa. None of us were. But he was becoming someone stronger. Someone who had walked through fire and emerged with the knowledge that he could survive. One evening in late spring, I collected the mail and found an envelope with an unfamiliar return address. The Arizona Elder Rights Foundation, an organization David had supported for years, though I had never paid much attention to his charitable work. Inside was a formal letter on heavy cream paper. They had heard about my case. They wanted to invite me to speak at their annual conference. They believed my story could help others. I read the letter twice, then set it on David's desk and looked at his photograph. What do you think? I asked the empty room. One more fight? The afternoon light seemed to brighten for just a moment, and I could have sworn I heard his answer. I accepted the invitation. David would have wanted me to. The Arizona Elder Rights Foundation held their annual conference in a hotel ballroom in downtown Phoenix, 7 months after the morning that changed everything. I stood backstage, listening to the murmur of the crowd beyond the curtain. Hundreds of seniors, caregivers, social workers, and advocates gathered to discuss the epidemic of elder exploitation that claimed thousands of victims every year. Most of those victims suffered in silence, too ashamed to speak, too isolated to seek help. I had nearly been one of them. When my name was announced, I walked to the podium on steady legs. The audience looked up at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to compassion. Many of them knew my story already. Vanessa's prosecution had made local news, and the connection to the Richard Sullivan case had generated additional coverage. But knowing a story from headlines is different from hearing it told by the person who lived it. I spoke for 30 minutes without notes. I told them about the Lexus, about the house, about the morning I woke up to discover my daughter-in-law had been systematically dismantling my life while I slept. I admitted that I had been targeted, manipulated, nearly destroyed. I didn't minimize my vulnerability or pretend I had seen through Vanessa from the beginning. Pride serves no one in these situations. Only truth helps others avoid the same traps. But I also told them what saved me. David's foresight, his refusal to die without preparing defenses for the battle he knew was coming. Rachel's expertise, Her willingness to dig deeper when others had given up, Ethan's courage, his secret recordings, his choice to stand with his mother when it mattered most. Only I would be giving up. My own refusal to accept defeat, to surrender to shame, to let kindness become weakness. See, age is not weakness, I said, looking out at the faces before me. Experience is not foolishness, and kindness is not stupidity. But kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. Protect yourselves, protect each other, and never be too proud to ask for help when someone is trying to take what you have built. And then the applause that followed was not for me. It was for everyone in that room who had faced similar battles, won or lost, and found the courage to keep fighting. And strong. The legal system delivered its verdict 3 months before the conference. Faced with overwhelming evidence, recordings, documents, testimony from multiple victims, Vanessa Crawford Hale pleaded guilty to elder financial exploitation and fraud. The plea deal allowed her to avoid trial on the more serious charges, including perjury and identity theft. But the consequences were still substantial. 4 years of probation, mandatory restitution, requiring her to repay every dollar she had stolen from me, a permanent restraining order prohibiting any contact, direct or indirect, for the rest of her life. The Richard Sullivan case resulted in a civil judgment. Thomas could not bring criminal charges against Vanessa for what had been done to his brother. The statute of limitations had passed, and the evidence of direct harm was less concrete than in my case. But the civil court found in Thomas's favor, ruling that Vanessa had exercised undue influence over Richard in his final years. Thomas finally received a portion of his brother's estate, the inheritance that should have been his all along. More importantly, he received acknowledgement. The court had said, in official language, that his brother had been exploited, that he had been right all along. I became a regular volunteer with the Elder Rights Foundation after the conference. I visited senior centers and spoke at community events. I sat with families who were watching loved ones disappear into the control of predators, and I told them what I had learned. I counseled people who had already lost everything, and I helped them understand that survival itself was a victory. Everywhere I went, I told people about David, his wisdom, his love, his protection that reached across death to save me when I could not save myself. His memory became a shield for others, a light in the darkness that predators prefer. On a warm spring evening, 8 months after the conference, I sat on my front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. The granddaughters had spent the afternoon in the yard, their laughter still echoing in my mind, even though they had gone inside with their father. Ethan was in the kitchen, cleaning up from dinner, humming a song I didn't recognize. The house was full of life again, full of noise and chaos and love, the way David had always wanted it. Beside me sat an empty chair, David's chair. I had considered moving it inside, storing it in the garage, removing the reminder of his absence. But I never did. Some absences are too important to erase. I looked at the chair and smiled. "We did it, my love," I whispered. "We did it together." The sunset deepened, the colors intensifying as the sun dipped below the mountains. The air smelled of spring flowers and fresh-cut grass, of new beginnings and old memories intertwined. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang its evening song. And for the first time in years, I felt at peace. Not because I had won, though I had. Not because justice had been served, though it had. But because I had honored the man who loved me enough to protect me, even from beyond the grave. I had turned his final gift into something that would help others. I had made him proud. The last light of the sun caught the edge of his chair, illuminating it in gold. And somewhere in that light, I could swear I saw David smiling. Claire Montgomery learned something that winter, that every person watching this story needs to remember. The people who try to destroy us often wear familiar faces. They sit at our dinner tables, smile at our family gatherings, and wait patiently for the moment we become vulnerable. But they underestimate one thing: the power of love that refuses to die, and the strength that comes from refusing to be a victim. David Montgomery could not fight beside his wife in her darkest hour, but he fought for her anyway, from beyond the grave, with every tool he could leave behind. His foresight, his preparation, his unwavering belief in the woman he loved, these became the weapons that brought a predator to justice and saved a family from destruction. If you or someone you love is facing a similar situation, know this: you are not alone, and you are not powerless. Age is not weakness. Kindness is not foolishness. But kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. Protect yourself, protect the people you love, and never be afraid to ask for help. If this story moved you, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed elder exploitation in your own family? What would you have done in Claire's situation? Your experiences and insights might help someone else who is watching right now and feeling alone in their struggle. Please like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, because sometimes the right story at the right moment can change everything. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Until next time, stay strong, stay wise, and protect the ones you love.